The Combine may be taking place in Indianapolis with the emphasis on incoming draft prospects, but John Schneider is plenty busy behind the scenes with a couple of Seattle's foundational veteran stars. What's the latest on Geno Smith, Tyler Lockett, and Ernest Jones? We're going to be taking a deep dive here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Whether you are down in San Diego, California, or across the country in Richmond, Virginia, we appreciate each and every one of you. I want to take 1 second here to apologize to our listeners. If you're not enjoying the sound today, I think there's something going on with our server because my mic is plugged in. It is working on every other platform, but I cannot get it to work on StreamYard. So unfortunately, I have to use the mic that is in my computer for this particular show. My apologies. Hopefully we'll get that figured out. But again, I do not think this is an issue on our end. So apologies for the echo. Apologies if it doesn't sound as good as normal. There's nothing we can do, but the show must go on regardless. So let's get to it now for our lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The NFL Combine now underway here in Indianapolis. Had a chance to hear from General Manager John Schneider today on a number of different topics, and most notably, a lot of updates on ongoing negotiations regarding contracts with a handful of players. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that quarterback remains at the center of these discussions. Geno Smith with 1 year left on his contract, Rob. We were able to ask about Geno Smith's status as far as extensions go, and this is what John Schneider had to say on that front. We're going to meet with him this week, meet with his agent, see where it goes. He's got another year, but we expect him to be our guy, but we want to do what's right too. So, of course, that last part of that statement has got plenty of fans in speculation season mode. Well, they want to do what's right. Listen, this is how general managers talk this time of year. John Schneider's not just going to out front just say, this guy's our quarterback without a but statement at the end of it. That's just the way it goes. You want to keep everything open, but everything we have heard from Mike McDonald, Klint Kubiak, now John Schneider has suggested that it's a matter of when, not if, when it comes to an extension. And the fact that they're going to be meeting with his agent and Geno Smith this week, it suggests to me that at least that this is something that both sides are very motivated to get done. And quite frankly, this extension might be needed to be done to get other stuff done, like signing Ernest Jones in free agency, because the cap space that you can open up by extending him.
Well, it's not just the cap space, Corbin. I think that it's just a sign to the rest of the team, whether they be the actual players currently on the roster or possible free agents that you might be bringing in. Players like an Ernest Jones that is debating do the Seattle Seahawks look like they are a winner? And I think that there is an awful lot of questions to be asked if Geno Smith is not your starting quarterback, or if there's any kind of speculation that he's not going to be the quarterback. So, yeah, I think that makes all the sense in the world that Seattle is going to prioritize Geno Smith, even though, as John Schneider said, and as you just mentioned, I mean, Geno Smith is under contract for another year. Now, he is due a roster bonus. I believe it's on March 16th. So there is a little bit of a timeline. But the fact that John Schneider did not even acknowledge that timeline, to me, suggests that, the same thing that you and Mike McDonald and John Schneider and I myself have already talked about, ad nauseum, is that Geno Smith is going to be the starter here in 2025 for the Seahawks. It's just whether or not they are going to be able to create a long-term, extension that might be able to create a little bit more salary cap flexibility for this year. But again, in John Schneider's own words there just a moment ago, Geno Smith is their guy. And if they are able to create a longer-term extension for him, so be it. But the more pressing need, at least in my opinion, would be Ernest Jones at the linebacker position, because, of course, he is a true free agent. And even the conversation with Tyler Lockett at the wide receiver position, he also is under contract, but his cost is so so cost prohibitive to the Seahawks that a salary cap number of 31 million. I mean, Geno Smith is a relative bargain at that point. So while quarterback is obviously always the priority, I think that there is an awful lot of conversation that he has to make on some of the other players on Seattle's roster rather than just number 7.
Yeah, I think when you're looking from an urgency standpoint, obviously the player that has a contract expiring is going to be the one that you want to get the deal done with, because Ernest Jones, if he hits the market, there are going to be other teams that have interest in a young 25-year-old linebacker with 3 straight seasons of 100 tackles. There are going to be other teams going to be floating money, and this is not a great linebacker free agent class either, as we've talked about. He would probably be the cream of the crop, the crown jewel in this free agent class. So if you let him hit the market, you're really risking losing him. So I do think the urgency is there. And it's interesting because I asked John Schneider about Ernest Jones and his negotiations today, and he made it clear that they've had discussions ongoing really since that trade that sent him from Tennessee. There was the lull after the end of the season where they stalled those discussions, but they're going to be reopening those talks this week as well. And I found it interesting because I thought at first he was accusing me of staring at his phone, which he didn't have his phone out to begin with. So I'm like, I didn't look at your phone, but he said that, well, he buzzed an hour earlier. So I'm assuming at that point that he was talking about the agent, one of the representatives for Ernest Jones, that they had reached out to him that morning. So they are working on getting this deal hashed out. They are actively negotiating again, trying to get it done. I would be in agreement with you that that's got to be the first priority. But as I mentioned, getting Geno Smith extended, 2023, they did it on March 6th, just a few days after the combine ended. They did all the groundwork for that extension at the combine. And I feel like they could be doing that again this time around so that they do have that extra cap space. They can go get Ernest Jones signed and make sure they're cap compliant when free agency opens. So this very easily could be a case where Geno Smith, even though he's not the one that has the urgency, he might be the one that gets done first to end up getting the dominoes going so they can re-sign Ernest Jones. As for Tyler Lockett, look, I'm just going to be, listen, we heard the comments from Tyler Lockett at the end of the season. As far as I could tell then, the writing was on the wall that Tyler Lockett had played his last game in Seattle, and maybe there still is a pathway forward. John Schneider said they're going to be talking with the agent of Tyler Lockett, and they're going to be seeing if there's something they can do. But the fact of the matter is that listening to the way that John Schneider responded today, it's just another sign that they are heading towards a split there. And that's just the reality of the business when you're talking about an aging player that's got a bloated contract like Tyler Lockett does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that John Schneider, I thought was interesting that he said that, Tyler Lockett, and I believe this is an exact quote, is from John Schneider, one of my all-time favorite players. That to me sounds like something that you would say when you are, preparing yourself to cut ties with, again, one of Seattle's, I think, all-time favorite players. I mean, there's no denying what Tyler Lockett has done for the Seahawks, but we talked about in the show last week, Corbin, 30 yards after the catch for the entire season. When you have a wide receiver in today's day and age where the game is all about your ability to make people miss, to be able to run over people, be able to run away from people after the catch at the wide receiver position, when you have an offensive coordinator in Klint Kubiak now whose entire game at the wide receiver position, again, is all about guys who can create after the catch, then look, Tyler Lockett always is going to have a place for in Seattle. I think that he is a guy that should be in the Ring of Honor, frankly. But at the same time, I also think that if Seattle is looking to go into the postseason, then they've got to get younger, they've got to get faster, they've got to get more physical at the wide receiver position, and that is assuming that you're bringing back a DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba continues to ascend. So I do think that the priority has got to be Geno Smith at the quarterback position for the same exact reasons that you just mentioned. He has got to be he should be the first domino to fall. Then Ernest Jones, and then again, Tyler Lockett. I just think that you can create so much cap room, and I think that you give your respect to what he has been for the Seahawks, but at the same time, unless he is going to come in for nickels on the dollar, then I really do think that unfortunately, Seattle is going to be looking for another starting receiver opposite DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba, and it is unlikely to be Tyler Lockett.
As I mentioned yesterday, the vast majority of the moves that the Seahawks have made around this time of year under John Schneider, they've typically happened in the week after the combine. But a lot of the groundwork is done this week in Indianapolis. So if anybody's expecting Ernest Jones or Geno Smith to get a new contract this week, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but most likely it's going to be next week at the earliest when they've had these discussions that are ongoing. Tyler Lockett, when it comes to cutting players, we've seen that window usually the beginning of March as well. Maybe that happens this week. Maybe they agree to a new contract this week. Who knows? But a lot of that news gets dumped next week. Even the Russell Wilson trade came the next week after the combine, even though those discussions happened while they were in Indianapolis. So I would say next week is that sweet spot where we potentially could see several of these moves start trickling in. But all the work is being done right now behind the scenes in Indianapolis. When we come back here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks, we're going to continue our combine preview. Yesterday, I broke down offensive and defensive linemen that were good personnel fits for the Seahawks and their coaching staff. We're going to look at quarterbacks coming up next, the premium position in professional football. We'll get to that here in a moment on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Again, those that are listening, I don't have a cold. I feel great. I just don't have a functional mic. And unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. It's working on every other platform on my computer, but I can't get it to work on StreamYard. So my apologies if I don't sound as crisp as normal. It is not my fault, and trust me, I'm not trying to abuse your ears on purpose. But I guess it happens. The show must go on. We are here in the NFL Combine, and Rob, we get to talk about premium positions today. The quarterback spot to start off, and I kind of kicked this off yesterday leading into the workouts here at Indianapolis with the offensive and defensive linemen, looking at a bunch of players that could be good personnel fits for the schemes in Seattle. Now we're going to get a chance to do that at the quarterback spot, which I think is a little bit interesting. We're talking about Klint Kubiak because he's had some success with very different type of quarterbacks during his time as an offensive coordinator or a quarterback coach. And that's a really good thing for the Seahawks, I think, because you're talking about a guy that has had the flexibility to be able to work with the strengths of different types of players. And that could be Kirk Cousins. It could be Russell Wilson. It could be this past season with both Derek Carr and Spencer Rattler, who are different style quarterbacks. He has been able to do that. And so now he gets Geno Smith and maybe a rookie quarterback coming in. And that makes this an interesting class to evaluate because there isn't necessarily a prototype for Klint Kubiak.
Well, there's not, but I think that also you have to have a basic degree of accuracy from the pocket. I think that the ability to be able to throw off of bootlegs and off of motion, I think that is very important. I think the accuracy, anticipation, arm strength, those are always going to be critical factors anytime that you are evaluating a quarterback. So I'm going to start off the conversation here, Corbin, with a guy that I just think from a combine perspective, I mean, he's going to have so many eyes on him because he's the most dynamic athlete of this year's quarterback. And that's a guy that I don't think is a clean fit in Klint Kubiak's offense. But at the same time, the upside is so immense. And I think that Mike McDowell might be reminded of a quarterback that he once worked with or maybe worked against, and that being Jalen Monroe from, and of course, the quarterback that I am referring to, that Mike McDowell might be, reminded of is, of course, Lamar Jackson, perennial MVP candidate with the Baltimore Ravens. And Jalen Monroe is one of those guys, Corbin. I've used the comparison to a Michael Vick, and I just think that you're going to see a guy who's going to run in the 4.4s at minimum, perhaps in the 4.3s. He might have the strongest arm of this draft class. At the same time, he is not shown consistent accuracy from the pocket, something that you and I have discussed many occasions. And he was not that impressive this past season at Alabama, even with Kalen DeBoer as the head coach. And of course, we saw the way that Michael Penix Jr., really ascended a couple of years ago for the University of Washington under Kalen DeBoer's tutelage. And so, look, there's a lot of reasons to suspect that Jalen Monroe is not a fit for the Seahawks. But again, I do think that we are seeing a different kind of a turning of the regard at the quarterback position in the NFL. I think that if you have a quarterback that can make defenders have to account for his athletic ability, then you might have to kind of just flip the switch and kind of do something a little bit different. So to me, Milroe is definitely a quarterback that I think that the Seahawks are going to be fascinated by, and then just see if there has been any development post this past season at Alabama, post Senior Bowl, if he has shown some improvement. So to me, he is one of the guys that I want to mention. Certainly Quinn Ewers from Texas. He, to me, is a quarterback that I've talked about before. I do think that he is a really nice fit in Klint Kubiak's system. I think that he is going to be more in that second to third round range that I believe that John Schneider is going to be a little bit more comfortable in drafting a quarterback. I love the fact that he played as well as he did on the road to beat Alabama 2 years ago, on the road to beat the defending champion Michigan Wolverines this past season. He does have great accuracy. He does have a better arm than his slight frame might suggest. And then finally, if we're talking about guys that, played their best in the biggest of moments, you have to acknowledge Will Howard from Ohio State, 6'4", 230 pounds. Does have mobility, does have arm strength, does have accuracy on the move, and again, has played his best in the biggest of big moments. That is something that John Schneider has always prioritized. So to me, Corbin, this is a quarterback class that is, assuming that Geno Smith does return to the Seahawks, then I do think that this is a class that Seattle might be looking to take advantage of and just allow a quarterback to develop. That's why I think that a Milroe might be somebody that they would consider, because you do have some time. But at the same time, if you're talking about guys that fit in with Klint Kubiak's system, I think the Quinn Ewers or Will Howard might be better fits. But there's several other candidates here. I'm curious to see who you think the Seahawks as a franchise and Seahawks fans should be paying attention to in Indianapolis this week.
I don't know that there's any system out there, Rob, that you can have a quarterback that doesn't have pocket presence and is not consistently accurate, that you can suddenly make them a viable starter in the league. I mean, I'm going to give this cautionary statement. Anthony Richardson a couple years ago, and do I still think there's a chance that Anthony Richardson could turn around his career? I do. I think that there's enough intangibles there, enough talent that you can still potentially squeeze out a quality starting quarterback from that molding that ball of clay that he is. Anthony Richardson had much better tape throwing the football overall, in my opinion, than Jalen Milroe did at the end of this last season. And I thought he had more pocket presence. Like, for all the athletic gifts that Jalen Milroe has, and you and I've talked about this before, how many times have we seen, especially late in the season, I'm thinking that bowl game against Michigan, it almost seems like Jalen Milroe is oblivious to what's going on around him a lot of the time. And when you have a guy with that kind of athleticism, you got to use it. And I felt like there were a lot of times that he didn't do that. And that's not even adding in the throwing stuff that you've got concerns about. And again, those are players you take chances on. And if he goes out and runs in the 4.3s, he's going to get picked earlier than he probably should, just because of the traits. There are going to be guys out there that think, I can coach this guy, I can mold him, and maybe he will. But I would rather have a guy that maybe isn't quite as athletic, but I know can throw the football at a much higher clip, and that's Jackson Dart. And look, Dart was a guy going into this process that I was looking at as a day two guy. I thought probably a second-round player. I think now there is a great, if not improbable chance, or probable chance, that he is going to be a first-round pick. I think at this stage of the draft, at the draft season, we're talking about a guy that has thrown for more deep balls, connected on more deep balls than any quarterback in college football the last 2 seasons. He has ran for over 500 yards each of the last 3 years. So he might not be a 4.3 guy, but he can run the football, and he knows how to use his legs. He's got good pocket presence. He's tough. Does he have flaws in his game? Are there concerns about the offensive system he's coming from and going to the NFL and translating? Lane Kiffin, there's a history there where quarterbacks have struggled going to the NFL after thriving in his system. So yeah, there's some flags to look at, but I think Jackson Dart is a much more complete player right now than what Jalen Milroe is. And I think there's still a lot of untapped potential there. So Milroe is a guy that I'll be watching, but Dart is somebody I'm really curious to see how he works out this week. And as far as 2 other players, I've talked Kyle McCord up quite a bit. If you watched him in the bowl game against Washington State, you can see the quick release. And when he's decisive, this guy's got a cannon. He can get the ball over the place. He set a record for ACC passing yards in a single season. He's not a scrambler. This is not a guy that is going to run for a bunch of yards, but I don't think he's a statue in the pocket either. And so I'm kind of curious to see what he does in the athletic testing, what he ends up participating in. But he is a player that I'm intrigued by. And the last thing I'm going to throw out here, Dillon Gabriel, I don't think is a starting quarterback in the NFL, but I think there's still the potential for him to be a really good number 2. And we've seen him light it up at 3 different schools at the college level. Size is a bit of a concern, but he's very accurate. He's a smart quarterback. He's been in a number of different systems. He's got some mobility, can run around a little bit. Those are the kind of guys that you want to at least bring in and develop and try to mold. And I think with all the experience he's had, if there's a guy that could maybe, if he had to play fairly early, Dillon Gabriel could be a guy that could do that. Again, I think he's a quarterback too, but I think he could be a pretty darn good one and a guy that can win some games for you as a spot starter if you have to go with it. So I don't know that he's the guy Seattle's looking for, but at the same time, he's got a lot of the traits that John Schneider has liked at the quarterback position in the past, Rob.
Oh, no question about it. I mean, I'm a big Dillon Gabriel fan. At the same time, he is also very slight. And so that's the thing, is that the combine could be an area where Dillon Gabriel actually drops a little bit just because of the durability factor. They're going to have to do all kinds of medical testing on him. When he walks through that room and he looks like a guy who's going to be, picking up the trash instead of actually throwing footballs at Lucas Oil Stadium, then again, I think there's going to be an awful lot of general managers who are going to be like, that's not an NFL quarterback. And then you watch the tape. Everywhere he's gone, he has won. So the same reasons I was kind of, highlighting Quinn Ewers and Will Howard. Hey, you're taking the words right out of my mouth when it comes to Dillon Gabriel. And I agree with you in terms of the upside of a Jackson Dart, as well as, just in Kyle McCord, we've talked about an awful lot. I mean, I think that when you watch the right tape with Kyle McCord, he looks like he should be an early first-round pick. Of course, we talked about the Pittsburgh tape that looks pretty scary, but the way that he played towards the second half of the season, and of course, the Seahawks played pretty darn well the second half of the season. There's something to be said for the fact that he basically got the boot at Ohio State and then winds up just leading the country in passing yards, passing touchdowns this past season. And I think that is the type of resiliency that the Seahawks have always prioritized. They might see somebody that kind of just matches their personal mantra there. So again, I think that there is a number of quarterbacks in that day 2, early day 3 area, that I really do think that fit in very nicely with the Seahawks. Like I've said this for years, and I've been expecting John Schneider to pull the trigger and select a quarterback to develop here. I do think that this, yet again, is another draft class that is ripe with players that really do fit in nicely with Seattle's long-term future.
We'll see if the Seahawks end up drafting any of these quarterbacks. John Schneider was hinting at it today. The board just hasn't fallen the way we've wanted to pick a quarterback the last several years. They haven't picked one since Alex Magoo back in 2018, and that was only the second quarterback that John Schneider has taken his entire time here. So we'll see if this is finally the season that they draft a quarterback. But regardless of who is under center when they open OTAs in May, there may be the need for a new pass catcher. So we're going to be talking receivers coming up next. Maybe not the deepest receiving class we've seen in recent years, but still several guys that fit as personnel fits for the Seahawks. We'll be breaking it all down when we come back here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, and thank you as always. We greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The NFL Combine underway in Indianapolis, continuing to go position by position, looking at personnel fits that could intrigue at this combine for the Seahawks. Let's shift our attention. We just talked quarterbacks. Now the guys that are catching the ball from these quarterbacks. And this is not the deepest receiving class we've seen. In fact, I'd say this is maybe the weakest receiving class we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. There's still plenty of talent, but compared to some of the groups that we've seen come through where 4, 5, 6 guys are getting picked in the first round, there might only be 2 or 3 at most that get selected in the first round. This year, it's possible it could be 1 or 2 because of the talent at other positions. The fact this is not a deep and not as top-heavy receiver group as we have seen in recent years. Still, Rob, Tyler Lockett, we talked about in the first segment, really good chance that he's not coming back to Seattle next season. There's all this rumbling about DK Metcalf's future. what's going to happen on that front. And Seattle didn't get a lot of contributions after those first three receivers last year. This is an underrated need, even with Tyler Lockett. If he leaves, as expected, this suddenly becomes a wild card need for Seattle's offense. And luckily, there are some players that still could fit the bill that could come in and be a really good number 3 receiver in Klint Kubiak's offense.
Yeah, and again, I think this is not just an underrated need or a wild card need for the Seahawks. Assuming that Tyler Lockett is not back, and hell, even if he is, just as you said, I mean, the production drop off after Seattle's top 3 receivers was absolutely precipitous. I mean, it was like the Marianas Trench. I mean, as far as what happened after those top 3 receivers. So I do think that this is a significant need for Seattle. Now, whether Seattle looks to go into free agency and consider some type of upgrade at the wide receiver position, or they go to the draft, I do think that wide receiver could wind up being arguably their biggest area of concern, assuming they bring Ernest Jones back, and then assuming they get some kind of quality coaching along the offensive line. And that is a conversation for a future podcast. But I do think that some of the comments that John Schneider made today, and what I anticipate that Mike McDonald is going to be saying tomorrow, is I think it's going to be basically indicating that Seattle feels like they have some talent along the offensive line. They just need to get more production from those blockers. So again, I think the wide receiver is a huge need for the Seahawks. So that's why I'm going to be talking about some guys I expect to be complete top 100 selections. In fact, the very first player I'm going to talk about is going to be, I believe, the first wide receiver off the board. Now, I mean pure wide receiver. There's been some talk now that with Travis Hunter, the Cleveland Browns said that he is there. They think that he is a wide receiver, despite the fact that he played fairly minimal snaps at the wide receiver position, at least in comparison to cornerback. I believe he is a better corner than wide receiver. Hell, I think that he's the best player in the draft. He can do whatever the heck he wants to do. He is not going to be available to the Seahawks at number 18 overall. However, Luther Burden III from Missouri, a guy that I like to characterize as Deebo Samuel Light. He is, in my opinion, the best yard after catch wide receiver in this draft class if DK Metcalf remains a Seahawk in 2025. If Jackson Smith-Njigba remains at the slot position in which he excelled, which he has played almost all of his snaps so far, his first 2 seasons in Seattle. To me, the best flanker wide receiver to complement those 2 guys is Luther Burden III. I just love his speed. I love his agility to make people miss. I love his physicality to run over the quarterbacks when he needs to do so. Look, he didn't put up the numbers this past season that was expected of him, but you look at Missouri's supporting cast and compare that to, say, Ohio State or Oregon or some of the other dynamic offenses out there. It was basically Luther Burden III and everybody else. I think that this guy is going to not necessarily wow people in workouts, but he's going to wow the scouts that watch him on tape. And I think that he is the first-round wide receiver in this draft class. There's a lot of talk about some of the other guys out there. And again, I mentioned Travis Hunter. But as far as a pure wide receiver, he is the guy. I do think there's a possibility that he is staring John Schneider and the Seahawks at the face at number 18 overall. I think that he could be a home run selection for an offense that needs some yak. This guy can bring it.
You want to talk about yak? Let's talk about Jalen Royals from Utah State. Now, he had an injury this season. He only played in 7 games, but he had almost 900 receiving yards in those 7 games. The year before, he had 15 touchdowns and well over 1,000 yards for Utah State. And this guy is 6'2", or 5'11", I mixed up a receiver. He's 5'11", 210 pounds. He's smaller in height, but he's powerful. This is a guy that breaks a lot of tackles. He does damage after the catch. And he's one of those guys that can really carve the field up in the intermediate. He can win contested catches downfield. This guy's not going to be mistaken as a deep threat like a DK Metcalf, but he is a player that has a lot of similarities to Jackson Smith-Njigba while being a player that has a little bit more speed on the outside. I'm curious to see what he does in this combine because I've seen some people say, I don't think he's the most explosive athlete. I don't expect him to run in the 4.3s, but I want to see how he runs because he is one of those guys that's sneaky fast when you watch him, and he creates a lot of space after the catch, and he has been absolutely dynamite. He also has good tape this year as a punt returner, so there's some special teams ability there as well. Jalen Royals could go in the 2nd round in this draft. as long as the medical's clear, and I expect they will. The injury he had was not that significant in that sense. But Jalen Royals is a player. If you haven't heard of him, turn on the tape against teams like Boise State, and you can see what this guy could do. He is a fantastic football player that does a lot of things on special teams, is hard-nosed, tough. He would fit the bill to try to correct that yak issue the Seahawks are dealing with.
Yeah, and a couple other players that I think also could do that. And as you mentioned with Jalen Royals, a guy that is had some medical issues that could push him down the board a little bit. But when you watch him on tape, I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, this guy is a real player. And so, to your point before about just kind of assessing the wide receiver class from a macro lens. I mean, just taking the big picture. This is not a class where there are the Marvin Harrison Jr.'s or just the immediate impact kind of a guys. But there is some intriguing talent that I think it might be available in day two. So I think that Trey Harris from Ole Miss, Jack Besh from TCU, two guys that struggled a little bit with injuries, two guys that wound up transferring. Trey Harris was originally, I lost my spot here. Originally at Louisiana Tech, but you look at this guy, 6'3", 210 pounds. The comparison I gave was actually to DK Metcalf because he is a little bit straight line-ish. He does have big, broad shoulders. He can absolutely bully people after the catch. But again, this is a transfer that came into Ole Miss. You mentioned before with Jackson Dart at the quarterback position and how the head coach and play caller, Lane Kiffin, can kind of change your evaluation of quarterbacks. Can do the same thing with wide receiver. And so Trey Harris, to me, has all of the upside in the world. I think that he has first-round upside, but he's got to prove that he is healthy after struggling with injury the last couple of seasons. Of course, making that transition from La Tech to Mississippi the past couple of years. But still, he is a big, strong, powerful athlete. If the Seahawks do decide to trade away DK Metcalf, to me, Trey Harris is one of the wide receivers that can kind of fill those massive shoes. The fact that he played at the same program, the Ole Miss Running Rebels, to me, it just makes it that much more interesting, I guess, in some ways. And then Jack Besh, I think that this is a player that, he originally was at LSU. I talked about him before, came back to and wound up being very successful this past season at TCU, goes to the Senior Bowl with a heavy heart. Tragically, his brother, passed away previous to that, and yet he winds up becoming the Senior Bowl MVP. We know how much priority the Seahawks have placed on Senior Bowl players. This is a guy who has terrific body control. He makes the contested catch look easy. He's 6'1", 215 pounds. So again, the size to be able to just shake off defensive backs and be able to create after the catch. To me, regardless of who the Seahawks select a wide receiver, and they will take a wide receiver in this draft class, it is going to be somebody that has real yak ability. That's not only because of the fact that Tyler Lockett has struggled in that regard in recent years, but also because that is an absolutely critical factor of Klint Kubiak's offense. So again, to me, these are three of the wide receivers I just mentioned, Burden, Harris, and Besh, that I really believe are some of the best wide receivers after the catch in this draft class without having too many drops, too many medical questions, and still playing at an elite level of competition.
My first guy that I mentioned, Jalen Royals, he's kind of that short, compact, running back build receiver, which those guys typically are going to be good at after the catch anyway because of the power that they have, the ability to break tackles. I want to look at two guys that are different body types, that are more that tall, lean type receiver that bring some unique traits to the position that can win downfield and also can create after the catch. Nick Nash, who was a quarterback when he first went to San Jose State. We've talked about it a few other times up to this point. More film that I watched, though. I absolutely love this kid. And you turn on the tape when he was a quarterback, like he was a dang good dual threat QB, like the read option, scramble stuff. He shows that when he gets the football in his hands after the catch. He's also a dynamic downfield threat. He led the entire nation this year in deep ball receptions that went for touchdowns. Pat Bryant from Illinois led the nation with 18-plus yards per catch among qualified receivers. And Illinois is not known for chucking the ball downfield, but he did it. He did it at the Senior Bowl, too. You can see the ability. He's 6'3", and Nick Nash is 6'3". Tyler Lockett, when he was in his prime, was one of the best downfield threats in the NFL. Both these guys can come in and give you that, both from the outside in the slot, and they also can create after the catch. They're both coming from programs that previously had not been known for slinging the ball over the place. Nick Nash had only been playing receiver for a couple of years. Patrick Bryant's coming from a program that doesn't necessarily chuck the ball downfield. They like to run the ball, and yet he put up 1,000+ receiving yards this year at Illinois. I think both of these guys on day 2, early day 3 would make a ton of sense for the Seahawks, because you're not only getting the big play element, which has been a part of Klint Kubiak's offense. His quarterbacks are consistently near the top in yards per attempt. Some of that's with the yak, but they take their shots downfield. You're going to have that element still in Seattle's offense, even with this new system, but you also add in the wrinkle of having guys that you can get the ball to quick that can do some damage after the catch. And I think both Nick Nash and Pat Bryant are guys that are more than capable of doing that and would make a lot of sense for the Seahawks. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to break down Mike McDonald's comments from the Combine, and we're going to be continuing our positional fits, our scheme fits for the Seahawks. We're going to be looking at tight ends and running backs on offense, and we're going to be looking at corners and safeties on the defensive side of the ball. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday night. Go Hawks.